With that, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. Before we move on to our published agenda, we have a proposed addition to our consent agenda to add a legislative directive relating to an overview on winter safety plans and emergency preparedness. Colleagues, the RCA is before you, and there are additional copies by the door. I'll move to amend the agenda to include that item after our consent agenda. May I have a second?
Second.
On the motion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? That motion carries and the agenda is amended. First, we will take up the public hearing on our agenda. Item number 1 is the consideration of a passage of an ordinance amending Title IX, Chapter 171 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances relating to the fire and police protection. Police, adding provisions related to fees for use of city-owned resources by external entities. With that, I'll invite Vice Chair Wansley to speak on that item.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I'm really excited for today because this has been almost 2.5 years, or actually 3 years in the making. With that, I will ask my policy aide, Celeste Robinson, who's also been critical in the policy development of this ordinance, or us getting to this point, to pull up the presentation. All right. So, when I entered City Hall in 2022, one of the major complaints and questions my office fielded were about the use of off-duty officers parked on Lake Street observing Michael's construction work. And I was repeatedly asked why the city was allowing officers to pick up off-duty while simultaneously pointing to staffing challenges as a reason for why residents were not getting follow-up on issues like burglaries or other police response related situations. And these conversations were accompanied by the council approving a buyback contract with a wealthy neighborhood, reinforcing residents' concerns that the city was essentially enabling a pay-to-play system as it relates to our policing system, or our police department. And I know Council President Payne at that time pursued taking action further around the buyback program, and I pursued looking at how we could further explore regulations around our off-duty programs in response to the feedback that we heard from our constituents about both. With that said, my office engaged with a number of stakeholders and staff to learn the history around our off-duty program, and basically what action steps were available to us to really rein it in, and to regulate it and install and institute guardrails and further regulations, essentially. So my office was encouraged to first look at the 2019 police off-duty audit, and this report was helpful, and I have included in the presentation here 4 corrective actions that was included in that report that the auditor referenced, and the timeline in which they anticipated completion of those items. And if you can move to slide number 2. And I will note, post the audit, it was unclear what steps, if any, had been taken as it related to the off-duty work. And I do also know that Mayor Fry did create a work group or task force, which also did not lead to any specific recommendations or actions, though many staff have pointed in many conversations about it to COVID as being a reason for why the work group no longer existed or did not yield any productive action steps or any action steps on the matter. If we can go to slide 3. So in having further conversations with staff around, again, okay, that's the history. What can we do? What can council do in our capacity and within our authority? I did learn from our staff and city attorneys that the city could administer fees to recoup the costs related to off-duties or to our off-duty program. And with that, I did a notice of introduction to begin the ordinance drafting process in November 2023. And in February of 2023, I authored a legislative directive requesting that the Fry administration provide more information about our off-duty program as a whole, where it stands, the status report, as well as to give us recommendations on what potential fees we could include to recoup the cost of administering our existing program. And essentially, that legislative directive came back to our appropriate committee at that time incomplete, and no recommendations were given. If we can go to the next slide. That said, my office then formulated a small work group to calculate the fee. And this included staff from Public Works, the City Attorney's Office, and Finance. And unfortunately, a couple months into the work, nearly all the staff that was working with the city at that time and with that smaller group had transitioned from the city. And with that, in 2024, I proposed a few different actions related to off-duty to the council, and was pleased that my colleagues supported all of those actions and they were passed. One was updating our research on the off-duty landscape, and that research was led by our policy and research division. And then the second was directing the city attorney's office to write an ordinance which would give the city the power to administer fees to recoup the costs related to off-duty work. And then the third was asking the Frye administration to conduct a fee study and give us information on what was needed to implement a fee program by May 1st. So with that, we also know at the beginning of this year, the Department of Justice brought forward, worked with the city to bring forward a consent decree that council passed. And in it included requirements around off-duty work. And while I am very supportive and happy that those requirements were included, I do want to note that the city did not have to wait for that consent decree to happen in order for action to be advanced around off-duty in particularly. And this ordinance also did not have to wait on the consent decree in order for it to happen today. I know that leadership at the city for many years have pointed also to the 1997 settlement agreement with the police union as a barrier for the lack of accountability and transparency as it relates to off-duty. And I don't want to relitigate that conversation, but I do want to encourage our city attorneys as we continue thinking about avenues for regulating and pushing, how do we actually make this system more equitable? I do think our city attorney should explore what it would look like to revisit that 1997 settlement case. And I'm really excited that, again, the consent decree really gives us the opportunity to really advance this conversation. And it's very complementary to what we're doing now and hopefully the future fees that we'll get to pass once that fee study comes back in May. And again, I'm glad that the DOJ consent decree also helped to reaffirm what many of our constituents had shared with us for years around their concerns around the off-duty program and the perception that it was encouraging this pay-to-play dynamic within our policing department and policing and public safety system. So last slide. So for today in this ordinance, if passed, essentially it will allow the city to collect fees on city-owned resources on off-duty. This ordinance is required before we can add any fee to a fee schedule. And should this ordinance pass, my office will then advance amendment to the 2025 fee schedule. And as of now, the off-duty fee study legislative directive, again, is set to come back to this committee, the Public Health and Safety Committee, on May 1st. So to ensure that this information would not be delayed again, I did reach out to the administration to check whether or not staff would be prepared by that deadline. And it was confirmed to my office last week that MPD has been assigned to fulfill the directive on that fee study, and they will be ready by the assigned deadline. So I am hopeful that this time around they will provide council with usable information, and we can begin to start charging the appropriate fees on a program that has historically cost the city and by extension taxpayers a lot of money. And for context, based on preliminary figures that our policy and research division shared with this committee last year, and MPD's own tracking report around off-duty hours in 2024, they shared that the city could have recouped up to $1.4 million if we did have some level of off-duty program that included fees for the equipment and resources that are being used. So again, I am very pleased that council has not shied away from advancing this work. And that being said, I want to also be very clear that this fee is likely the only meaningful legislative action that this council can take related to off-duty, especially under the landscape of government structure, and noting that the police department falls within and under the sole authority of the mayor's office. And the reality is that most of the actions needed to significantly reform the program are operational, and then again require leadership from the mayor, and likely also in collaboration with the Office of Community Safety. So I anticipate that we will continue to use our oversight functions amongst the council and amongst this committee to ensure, though, that off-duty no longer continues to be utilized in a way that contributes to the erosion of public trust. And I also look forward to this committee ensuring that the program is going to be run effectively and, most importantly, recoups the full cost that has largely been passed on and subsidized by taxpayers for many, many years. So with that, I will wrap up my comments and stand for questions. And I know we also have the city attorney who has been really great in working with our office in drafting the ordinance language that's before you today, who can also review it and answer any questions about that as well.
Thank you, Vice Chair Wansley. I also want to acknowledge that we are joined by Councilmember Ellison, Councilmember Rainville. I see Council President on cue as an author to speak on this item. I'll then proceed to open the public hearing. After that, I think we can debate the ordinance in front of us. Council President Payne.
Thank you, Chair Chavez, and thank you, Vice Chair Wansley, for your leadership on this topic, and I hope you would be willing to add me as a co-author.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. So, at this time, I'm going to proceed to open the public hearing to discuss the fees for the use of city-owned resources ordinance. If you have not signed up yet and wish to speak, please see the clerk to sign up. Each speaker will have 2 minutes to provide testimony. With that, is there anybody signed up to speak? Awesome. So, seeing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Seeing that no one wishes to speak on this item, I will now close the public hearing. Colleagues, are there any questions from any of you? Councilmember Rainville.
Thank you. I'm wondering, do we have any data on what this proposed ordinance would do for the use of off-duty help? You know, off-duty, when there are off-duty officers on duty, they also answer emergency calls and are an asset to our public safety. So do we know, or do we have any idea of the effect of this on the use of off-duty police officers?
Vice Chair Wansley?
Yes, thank you, Chair Chavez. So I do want to note again that this ordinance does not deal with that scope. But what I will say is when we did have Chief O'Hara come to this committee to talk about off-duty last year, I asked that same question around how are we tracking off-duty, and I believe that very specific question was also raised around how are we tracking between when an officer transitions between an off-duty assignment and then becomes active. And from my understanding, and this is likely in a staff memo report, MPD at that time could not say how or had any data to assess how they could track that. So I hope that that is part of some of the things that's going to be supported through the consent decree provisions and requirements that are now in place place. But this ordinance is largely around how are we making sure that at least minimum by the state statute guidelines, that 90% of the costs associated with this program that's passed on to taxpayers are recouped through fees.
There's a state statute that, could you explain that again, the use of a state statute for off-duty?
Absolutely, and city attorneys, feel free to also affirm this, that state statutes around our fees require that at least at minimum, we have to recoup about 90% of our costs.
Thank you, I understand that. I thought you were talking about specifically for off-duty fees.
I mean, this also applies because it will be a program using fees.
Yes, I understand that. So what I'm hearing you say is we have not had any communication back from the police department about what they think the effect of this would be?
That is not what I said. I believe I answered your question in terms of MPD was not able to provide data around how they're tracking when an officer is going between an off-duty assignment and then active duty. Our office has been working closely with MPD and all staff for the past 3 years around this very ordinance and its effectiveness.
So you did answer the first question. Thank you for that. The second question I have is, have they recently said if this ordinance goes into effect, what would the impact be on the hiring of off-duty police?
So, Councilmember Rainville, that has not come up because, again, most of the audits have noted that we do need to put guardrails in place. Like this, Chief O'Hara has come out and said that we need to charge fees himself. So I have not heard any concerns around this flagged, but you're more than welcome to raise this as a staff memo if that's something you would like follow up on with the city clerks. And then maybe at the May 1st legislative directive report back when we get that fee study report.
Yes, thank you very much for the offer. I appreciate that. I just think there's always two sides to every story, right? And I'd like to hear their side of it.
And again, I think this is actually one side. This is something that has come from actually MPD, who understands that this is something that has been a corrupted and inequitable program. Also, the Department of Justice. And this is one of the most basic regulations that we could ever do within the council side. And I'm glad that, again, leadership like Chief O'Hara himself has been someone who has supported measures like this that we're bringing today.
Thank you.
Council President Payne.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. Vice Chair Wansley spoke to this a little bit in her opening remarks around some of the work that we were kind of on this parallel path of looking at outside employment, whether that was off-duty work as being discussed here, or buybacks, which is technically on payroll, optional off-duty work, optional overtime that is paid for by an outside party. And it's always been my contention that either we have a staffing shortage and we're at critical staffing levels, or we have enough capacity to flex into some of these optional overtime shifts, whether off-duty or buyback. And the logic doesn't hold that we're at a critical staffing level and there's still enough flex for officers to have the capacity to do these types of shifts. That's been my perspective on this. And additionally to that, this is really an issue around officer wellness and fatigue. If they are taking on these extra shifts, whether off-duty or buyback, it's that many more hours that they are on detail. It's that many more hours that they're not getting rested. It's that many more hours that they're not spending time with their family. And we know that this can be a very burnout role to be in, and we want to be protective of that. And so also what was highlighted was just some of the data capabilities that we were lacking, the tracking capabilities that we were lacking. And I think that going towards a fee is going to actually be, from an infrastructure perspective, really important for us as well. Not just because of the requirement that any fee that we charge has to recoup cost, like the hard costs of wear and tear on the vehicle, fuel, and so on, there's investments that we need to make around our tracking capabilities that I think will lend itself towards better oversight of this program. That court injunction puts limitations on what we can and can't do, but this is just a good governance step when it comes to having the infrastructure to do the tracking to ensure that our officers are not getting fatigued and worn out, and that they're ready for their primary responsibility, which is on-duty shifts in service of the residents of Minneapolis.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we should tighten up car usage. But a question here that is very similar to Councilmember Rainville's, maybe it's the same, is that officers are still expected to respond if there's a situation near them that requires police, even if they're off duty. So does that mean the cost they pay for a squad car off duty would be prorated based on that kind of response? Does it happen so seldom that nobody cares? I'm not sure what the answer would be on such a thing. And I'm curious, I bet the authors thought through this, so I'm curious.
Vice Chair Wansley.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to remind committee members, the item that we are considering today is enabling legislation for us to be able to collect fees. And then we are asking MPD to give us a comprehensive analysis on what fees they can collect. Hopefully it's squad usage. And then I think these are really good conversations or good questions to direct to MPD as they're thinking through that analysis of how this is factored into active time and off-duty time. How are they utilizing tracking to be able to assess those fees accurately so that we are reaching that 90% state statute mandate and also being able to reach or provide adequate services to our residents. So I think those are all things that will be answered in the second phase. But today, we are taking up the first requirement before we can even get to the second phase, which is making sure we can have the legislation to be able to do that work.
So thank you. I appreciate that. And I do want for MPD when they respond to be able to come back with something that can acknowledge that complexity, because I want every off-duty officer to be able to swap into active duty whenever necessary. That's a community multiplier, so I really don't want to limit that in off-duty work. Per a conversation I had recently with a retired MPD leader, they said that the use of squads for off-duty began ages and ages ago with off-duty officers that worked at high schools because it was about the ability to safely be able to transport somebody somewhere if there needed to be a transport. And then he says it became mission creep that then officers working in places like parking ramps or places where traffic control was needed, that became useful in handling traffic situations, or when it was too cold or too hot, it was like a landing pad for officers between duties, and pretty soon everybody was doing it. So, but as long as there were enough squad cars, this additional visibility made sense for them to be seen that they are there out in the community, and I do want that to be the case. I want places like Michael's and other contractors that require them to absolutely pay for that in some of their fees. But when, to the point that squads are taking places to avoid paying parking fees, my pet peeve, idling, and I mean, it really ticks off the public, and I'm one of them, when we see squad cars just idling excessively, unless there's a canine in the car, obviously. Shut them off. This excuse of, oh, we're draining the battery is a weak one at best, I think. But bottom line, there are legitimate public purposes when cars should be used. But I certainly object when it's being used for personal convenience, as I see it sometimes being done. I'm also curious if in this look, and as it pertains to squad cars again, is the availability of squad cars a problem given our current staffing deficit? Do we have any sense of how many officers we have versus squad cars that could be checked out, used? I would rather them be out in the community than in a parking lot.
For that question, I don't know if anybody from MPD is here to answer, but if not, I would think of
May I
administrative
do a
follow-up.
Staff memo?
Yeah, a staff memo for that
Thank you.
question. And then Councilor Palusano, if you can repeat that, just so Rachel and our clerks can hear that again.
My question was, is the availability of squads a problem given our current staffing deficit? So the number of officers we have based versus the number of squad cars. I understand that they are staffed typically 2 to a vehicle, but in off-duty situations, they're often 1 to a vehicle, or able squad is what that's called. So, thank you.
Thank you. And next up, we have Councilmember Rainville and then Vice Chair Wansley.
Thank you, and thank you, Council President Payne, for bringing up the court injunction effort when we talk about off-duty and police. This is an incredibly complex ordinance. I'm going to vote for this. I think we should move it forward. It's a worthy discussion it has as we try to improve our public safety for the citizens of Minneapolis. But again, it's very complex, and for us to do this the right way, we do need that input from the police department. So I look forward to having them more involved as we move forward. Thank you.
Vice Chair Wansley.
Yeah, and I just want to summarize again that this has been 3 years of legislative work done in collaboration with critical departments that's inclusive of the administration, such as the police department, also Chief O'Hara, the city attorneys. But also in this conversation, I think it's important to level set again around there's, as Council President Payne has highlighted, one, this dynamic in the predominant concerns that we've heard from our constituents around off-duty is this perception and this constant hearing about staffing challenges. And yet we're hearing from our constituents that when they see an officer in uniform using city resources in front of Michael's Construction, or they see them at at their shopping center or at a store at a shopping center like Target in after hours, but they're not getting appropriate responses. Those type of realities are hard to reconcile for our residents. And I think this conversation of, are we prioritizing basically side gigs for our city employees? That is a larger conversation in itself, and that's why I've encouraged our city attorneys to really think through how we could challenge that 1997 court injunction, because once again, there is no city employee or city employee unit in our enterprise like Public Works that can go out and use basically Public Works trucks to go in their side or their private time to go and basically do a side hustle and use trash collection trucks to go collect money for their own private gain amongst their neighbors. That's not allowed anywhere else in the city, but we have allowed it here. And that is a troubling dynamic. So I do think that is really something that this body, we all should be concerned about. And this idea of whether or not we're making it challenging for officers to partake and essentially what is become, again, a side hustle that's subsidized by the public. When an officer takes an off-duty assignment, and if something happened, if they enacted harm on a civilian, or if harm was even to happen to them, it would be the public who would pay for the liability for that. But the officer will receive the private gains from that. Like this, as the DOJ has highlighted, is a system that's constantly just ripe for corruption, just ripe for all sorts of inequities. And I am very glad that we are taking at least one step that is within our authority to try to enact some regulations around this so that we aren't putting our constituents as well as officers themselves in these financially precarious positions, or putting the city in a liable position any further as it pertains to what has been a very problematic program for the city and for our residents. So I do want to acknowledge that piece. And of course, there's going to be many more conversations around what this means for our city, especially in anticipation from MPD, what that fee study analysis will look like. And then as we think about what fees to include in the 2025 fee schedule. So with that, again, I encourage my colleagues to support this as the first step of hopefully the few that we can take to regulate this program within our own authority.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, the motion to approve the passage of ordinance for fees for off-duty use of city resources is before us. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Apologies. Councilmember Payne.
Aye.
Rainville.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Vice Chair Wansley.
Aye.
Chair Chavez.
Aye.
We have 6 ayes and 0 nays.
That motion carries. Colleagues, there are 3 items on today's consent agenda and 1 item recommended for postponement, and then an additional item that I walked on. Item number 2 is authorizing an extension of a grant with the Minnesota Department of Human Services through June 30th, 2025 for naloxone education and distribution. Item number 3 is accepting a grant from the Federal Office of National Drug Control Policy to address regional drug threats. Item number 4 is authorizing the submittal of a grant application to the Minnesota Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management and to execute a contract with the Minnesota Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management to support emergency management mission areas of prevention, preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery. And item number 5 is postponing the Safe and Thriving Communities Report and Plan for Public Safety Beyond Policing to our February 5th committee meeting. Colleagues, I move approval of the consent agenda in addition to postponing item number 5 to the February 5th meeting. Are there any discussion on these items? Councilmember Rainville.
Thank you. For item 2 on the consent agenda, does anybody know the amount that grant is for? There's dollar figures on these other ones, but how much is this?
If staff can come up and give a little overview of this item. If I'm looking at the item before us, it talks about the original grant being $250,000, which was back in 2021, and this year it is, it does not say.
And that's fine. If there's not an answer, that's okay. I can get one later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if we can just follow up with the staff memo on getting the exact number of what this grant is increasing the amendment, because this is something that we have had in the past, how much that is, and then we can also follow up with the health department and provide it to the rest of the PHS committee ahead of the full council meeting. All right. Anybody else on queue? Great. I'll move approval of items 2 through 4 and postpone item number 5 to the February 5th meeting. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? That carries, and the consent agenda is approved. And now the last item, I'll make this very quick. We have a walk-on item. No, I should have put it on consent, but it's a quick one, colleagues, and if you have questions, please let me know. We emailed you all about this, but basically, we work with the administration on this legislative directive to prepare a presentation for the February 5th meeting to get an overview of winter plans for safety and well-being, including interjurisdictional services and resources for people experiencing homelessness and the surrounding community from incident, weather, and community safety concerns. And the second component is public information on the emergency preparedness plans relating to emergencies around unsheltered homelessness and any plan to mitigate risk faced by people who are unsheltered or unhoused during extreme weather. If any of my colleagues have any questions, I think a lot of us on the dais here today have been meeting with a lot of folks who are organizing and supporting our unsheltered residents, on top of MUD, and folks who are organizing and figuring out ways to have the city, county, state, and federal government step up in addressing unsheltered homelessness. This is one step and one of the asks that some folks from MUD made about the winter safety component. The second component that we are bringing forward today is figuring out what our emergency preparedness plan is when it comes to addressing unsheltered homelessness. You all probably know about the variety of fires around encampments that have been happening across the city for many years, and we want to figure out what the city's response is in that, figure out any missing gaps, and figure out how we can work both as a city, both the mayor, the city council, administration, and staff together to figure out how we can address this issue more collaboratively. So this is an effort to work together and figuring out ways we can address this issue, and then find out ways we can work beyond just a city, making sure we're bringing in the county, state, and federal government as well. So this is just one thing we're doing and figuring out how we can address it together. So it's always good to get more information, figure out missing gaps, and figure out what the next steps are going to be. So with that, if colleagues have any questions, please let me know. I'll first pass it on to Council President Payne and then Councilmember Rainville.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I actually dug up our emergency operations binder that we received back in 2021 during orientation, and that version of it was from 2016. It had a hot weather response and a cold weather response, and I think that whatever the conditions were in 2016, we're just dealing with a different scale of needs in our community when we hit these sub-zero temperatures, especially for our unhoused community. And I think that, you know, the goal of that operations manual is to name roles and responsibilities, and it's pretty limited as it's currently authored, at least as of the 2016 version. It doesn't get that into depth around community organizations. It names the health department of maintaining a list of those community organizations, but I think there's a pretty big gap between what we have as our formal emergency operations plan, and I know that there are activities and lists of organizations and partnerships that we have, but I think it will be good for us to have a little bit more granularity outlined in that plan, especially given the reality of the size of our population of folks living outdoors in some of these really, really terrible conditions. So, thank you.
Councilmember Rainville and then Vice Chair Wansley.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I would like to be added as author, if that's all right with you.
Yes.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for the work on this. This is really important, and as complex as the off-duty and car use is, this is even more complex. President Payne years ago said to me, we have to solve the problem, even though it's not our responsibility. If we could just solve the problem and send the bill up to the county and state and federal governments, and I think in a perfect world, that's what we would do. We would fix the problem, and we would build these other agencies. So let's maybe shoot for that as a goal.
I love it. If we can make sure that Councilmember Rainville is an author, and next up we have Vice Chair Wansley.
Thanks, Chair Chavez. I just want to say thank you to the co-authors for bringing this forward. I think we all were in attendance of that MUD meeting where this was explicit ask of our indigenous community to really think through how we can support a number of issues that have been largely and disproportionately impacting that community, and also where that community has had to bear the brunt of the burden and really trying to mitigate and resolve, and have asked for more support from governmental partners like us here at the City of Minneapolis. And they asked explicitly the council members in attendance and all the city leaders who were in attendance to do what they could to support many of the asks that they brought forward. And this was one of them, of how are your agencies approaching safety plans during the winter, especially around making sure our unhoused communities are not only guaranteed safety, but robust supports and resources that are constantly not provided to them. So thank you all for listening and bringing this forward and making sure that we get a timely response, and the public in the community gets a timely response on that. So I just wanted to extend gratitude for that. And also, if you could also add me as an author.
If the clerks can make sure that both Councilmember Rainville and Vice Chair Wansley can be added as authors, please. All right, looking at the speakers list, there seems to be no one left on queue. So seeing no further discussions or questions, I'll move approval of this item. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? That motion carries, and the item will be forwarded to our full council meeting. Seeing no further business before us, I will declare this meeting adjourned.